By December 1944, the Western Front had grown deceptively quiet. Snow padded the Belgian forests, muffling engines and footsteps alike. The Allied High Command, confident that Hitler's forces were crumbling, eased into logistical planning for the final push toward the Rhine. Yet beneath those placid drifts lay the seeds of chaos, the last great German gamble of the war. Omar Bradley, commander of the U.S. 12th Army Group, spent the first week of December in endless meetings and field visits. To his calm Midwestern manner, winter meant consolidation. Fortify positions, secure supply lines, rotate tired divisions, and expect nothing more dramatic than frostbite reports. The Allies had rationed fuel and winter clothing carefully. With Eisenhower's approval, Patton's Third Army had even lent some tanks to maintenance depots further south. The European war seemed to be settling into an administrative rhythm. Then there was Patton George S. Patton, Jr., the old blood and guts who despised stagnation as much as a field mouse hates snow. His Third Army, hugging southeastern Belgium and Luxembourg, had clawed eastward through Lorraine months before. The men were veterans of Metz and Nancy, exhausted yet itching to prove themselves again. Patton's reconnaissance units kept probing along the Luxembourg border, reporting German murmurs beyond the Siegfried Line. Official orders told him to rest and refit. His instincts told him otherwise. In his warmer moments, Bradley affectionately called Patton a magnificent pain in the neck. Both men respected each other deeply, but their chemistry resembled flint and steel. Useful friction, always sparking. Bradley embodied patience and coordination as Eisenhower's grounded strategist. Patton embodied willpower, incarnate Eisenhower's lightning bolt. Keeping both men aimed in the right direction required diplomacy worthy of the United Nations and nerve worthy of a tank commander. Meanwhile, in the thick forests of the Ardennes, Hitler prepared a gamble, bordering on fantasy. Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, was his bid to split the Allied front, recapture Antwerp, and negotiate peace on his own terms. The German buildup had been astonishingly covert. Columns of troops moving by night, camouflage nets over tanks, radio silence maintained with maniacal discipline. Allied air reconnaissance, grounded by weeks of fog and heavy snow, saw little more than blank whiteness. Thus, the stage was set. Bradley's sector, largely held by the U.S. First Army under Courtney Hodges, appeared tranquil. The thinly spread divisions there were inexperienced engineers, artillery, and newly arrived infantry regiments enjoying what headquarters called a quiet front. Further south, Patton's Third Army was replenishing in the Luxembourg area, theoretically on stand-down. He had, however, ordered his intelligence staff to dream in German, which loosely translated to expect trouble. Even his chaplain sensed it, scheduling impromptu services for Christmas as though time were running out. By mid-December, Allied newspapers carried cheerful headlines about home for Christmas expectations. In one of Patton's war diaries, he scribbled between profanities that complacency was the most dangerous condition known to man, worse than stupidity, for it can infect the clever. His staff knew the pattern. Boredom made him restless. Restlessness led to ideas, and ideas led to yet another unofficial maneuver that would thump against Bradley's rulebook like a cannonball through tissue paper. Still, the rigid command structure of the Western Front had its logic. Eisenhower was supreme commander. Beneath him, Bradley coordinated the 1st, 9th, and 3rd U.S. Army as the 12th Army Group. Montgomery commanded the 21st Army Group in the north. Devers ran the 6th Army Group further south. Each had national boundaries, logistical zones, and crucially supply pipelines that could not be tangled casually. The front ran roughly north-south, and the dividing line between Bradley's and Devers's areas, as well as between American and British sectors, was not an artistic suggestion. It was a lifeline. Patton measured lifelines differently. To him, every road was a potential tank route, every border a negotiable rumor. The Third Army's intelligence estimated something ominous, a swelling of German radio traffic east of Luxembourg, and strange road movements near the Eifel. His operations officer, the diligent and long-suffering General Gaffey, drafted contingency plans for a northern wheel perhaps, a 90-degree pivot to hit any enemy attack in the flank. Gaffey filed the plan semi-formally, marking it for study only. Patton quietly memorized it. Bradley, meanwhile, remained convinced the Germans were incapable of major offensives. They were fighting in Norway, the Balkans, Hungary drained and retreating everywhere. Besides, the Ardennes terrain was miserable for tanks. Narrow roads, rolling woods, dense with snow and mist. What commander besides Patton would pick it for decisive battle? At dawn on December 16, 1944, the tranquil map exploded. Along a 60-mile front from Monchaux southward, German artillery roared. Panzer columns smashed into thin American lines. Communications collapsed. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. Bradley first heard of it while shaving in Luxembourg City. He initially thought the reports exaggerated. Within hours, it became clear the enemy's thrust was vast and coordinated. Headquarters buzzed like a hornet's nest. Hodges's First Army reeled back, divisions melting in the white chaos. Bastogne, a road hub, became central almost by accident. Not that, if untied, would let German armors spill west toward the Meuse River. Patton was already smiling that sharp, predatory smile that meant he smelled opportunity. Meetings with weather-beaten staff officers turned kinetic. In Verdun, on December 19th, Eisenhower held a conference with his senior commanders, Bradley, Patton, and Bedell-Smith among them. There, Patton stunned everyone by announcing that his Third Army could pivot north within 48 hours to relieve Bastogne. Bradley blinked. The fuel alone, the road clearances, the coordination, it sounded impossible. Yet Patton had already anticipated it. 3 separate contingency plans for 3 different pivot directions were sitting in his briefcase, waiting for one word of approval. Eisenhower gave the order. Bradley nodded with cautious pride. But one logistical detail complicated matters. To strike north toward Bastogne, Patton would need to swing part of his army through another command's zone, crossing borders, not just geographic, but bureaucratic. The 12th Army Group's internal seams were suddenly irrelevant in the face of catastrophe. Yet to Bradley, command, discipline, and Allied unity were sacred. An American division appearing unannounced in a British supply sector could cause chaos and political headaches in London and Washington alike. Patton listened to those cautions once, then issued his movement orders anyway. Convoys snarled along icy roads. Engineers worked by flashlight to widen bridges. Tanks rumbled through snowfall like prehistoric beasts. To the soldiers, it was a miracle of logistics. To Bradley, it was the opening note of a symphony that had better end in victory or scandal. While Patton's forces churned north, Bradley monitored the developing bulge on the map, its bow pushing toward Bastogne and eventually toward the Meuse. He respected Patton's audacity, but dreaded its consequences if coordination failed. Allied warfare in late 1944 had become almost corporate in its interlocking complexities. Fuel ledgers, liaison officers, radio ciphers. Patton's instinctual moves sliced through those webs, thrilling at the operational speed, terrifying the administrators retroactively cleaning up after him. Bradley's aides began hearing him mutter about that wild horseman again, though within the same breath he'd admit, "But God help me, he might be exactly what we need." By Christmas Eve, frost-rimed trucks carried precious fuel and ammunition into the southern Belgian hills. Columns marched through villages lit only by chimney glow. Patton's divisions, including the 4th Armored, were pushing relentlessly toward Bastogne's relief. From the air, when the weather briefly cleared, reconnaissance officers marveled at the sight. Serpentine trails of armor weaving north like molten iron through snow. Somewhere in his camouflaged headquarters, Bradley looked over those reports and sighed the pragmatist, staring at the artist of war gone rogue. The line had been crossed, literally and figuratively, and now the outcome would justify or condemn it. He poured himself coffee gone cold, muttering something the staff would later remember as half admiration. Half reproach, Patton's ignoring my maps again. He'd better make it worth it. Snow still fell thick over the Ardennes, hiding columns of tanks that crawled through the sleet like gray shadows. General George S. Patton, Jr. had turned his Third Army north to pierce the German Bulge, but his route sliced across a boundary line that maps insisted was forbidden. Those dotted borders belonged to another command. To Patton, they belonged only to common sense and momentum. At his Luxembourg headquarters, General Omar Bradley reviewed the latest situation report. Red arrows representing Patton's advancement now climbed straight into an area shaded for British coordination. Headquarters murmured in confusion. One aide, brave enough to comment, said, "Sir, Third Army units are using Montgomery's roads and fuel depots." Bradley's response was cool but sharp. "Then George has just borrowed half of England." He removed his spectacles, polished them slowly, and ordered a radio link to Patton's forward command truck. Through static and engine roar came the famous gravel voice. "George," Bradley began, "you're over the border again. Conti's staff say they're seeing your convoys instead of theirs." Patton answered with unmistakable glee. "Omar, we're 50 miles from Bastogne. The men are tired, the roads are open, and I'm not stopping for a line drawn in ink." Bradley's tone hardened. "That boundary exists for a reason. Coordination keeps this alliance alive." Patton replied, "And Americans are dying while we coordinate. Paper lines won't save them." Then Bradley delivered the sentence his staff would quote for decades clear. Clipped and furious. "You're risking the alliance." The connection crackled. For a heartbeat, only snow whispered around tank hulls. Then Patton growled, "Alliance or not, I'll reach Bastogne." The line went dead. Bradley stared at the silent radio. "He's gone," an aide murmured. The general exhaled through his teeth. So have the borders, apparently. Hours later, steel treads thundered across frozen bridges toward Bastogne. Reports flooded headquarters. Third Army making rapid progress. Minimal resistance. Bradley followed every update with conflicting emotions, exasperation, admiration, fear. If Patton succeeded, he would be branded heroic. If he failed, the headlines would read American ego, Rex, Allied unity. Eisenhower, pragmatic as ever, received both generals' messages at SHAEF. Instead of anger, he chuckled dryly. "Move the boundaries to match the tanks," he told his operations staff. Such was the flexibility that held the vast coalition together. Bradley said little publicly, but inside his mind, the balance sheet was intolerable. One side labeled victory, the other discipline. Which side of the page would history value most? On December 26th, the day after Christmas, Patton's leading elements, The 4th Armored Division smashed into Bastogne's southern perimeter. Snow draped the wreckage like powdered glass. Inside the city, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe and his 101st Airborne Troops had survived siege, frostbite, and ceaseless shelling. When the first Sherman tank burst through the German line, the defenders cheered with numb disbelief. A radio signal raced back to headquarters, Bastogne relieved. At his map table, Bradley read the short message, signed Patton. It said simply, "Merry Christmas." He smiled despite himself. "Merry Christmas, you incorrigible fool," he muttered, emotion breaking through professionalism. The relief was total, and so, perhaps, was the vindication of insubordination. Days later, they met in the churned mud of a field command post. Patton arrived, wearing his gleaming helmet and revolt-proof grin. Bradley stood near a jeep, arms folded. Their staffs kept respectful distance, pretending to check papers that no longer mattered. Bradley spoke first. "Congratulations. You turned a map error into a victory." Patton wiped road grime from his gloves. "I told you, Omar boundaries are for clerks. Clerks keep armies fed," Bradley replied dryly. "You embarrassed Montgomery. You stepped on Devers's supply tail. And you gave the diplomats heartburn." "But," Patton interrupted, "I saved Bastogne." A long pause. Bradley nodded once. "That you did." He stepped closer, voice lowering so only Patton could hear. "Just remember this. Sometimes the alliance is the greater battlefield. We win the shooting war, only to start the political one." Patton's stare softened. "Politics doesn't win freedom," Bradley answered. "It preserves it." Then, letting the matter close, he extended a gloved hand. "Now, go clean up the rest of this mess." Patton grinned and saluted, a gesture somewhere between respect and rebellion. When the snow began to melt, the after-action reports reached desk officers and historians. They recorded tonnage moved, bridges repaired, men lost. Hidden between figures was an innocuous phrase, "boundary adjustments validated retrospectively." In plainer language, headquarters legalized Patton's disobedience after victory proved him right. Bradley reviewed the draft before signing. "Make sure the record shows cooperation," he said. That was diplomacy wrapped in understatement. Deep down, he knew there had been almost none. For days afterward, he wrestled with conflicting truths. The textbook soldier in him demanded predictability. The human leader recognized genius rarely travels with a permission slip. When a staff colonel congratulated him on the victory, Bradley replied, "Thank Patton. I only set the chessboard." In early January, Eisenhower reorganized forces, blending logistics so thoroughly that borders became nearly invisible. It was a quiet acknowledgement of reality. Rigid divisions could not survive dynamic warfare. Bradley accepted the shift with pragmatism. His anger had cooled into uneasy admiration. During a later press conference, a reporter asked whether Patton's actions had violated orders. Bradley answered with calm irony. No orders were violated that weren't soon rewritten. The room laughed, but behind the joke hid respect. Privately that night, he wrote in his field diary, "Patton's disregard forced momentum when hesitation could have cost the campaign." Must remember that leadership implies elasticity. When spring softened the hard ground, the two generals met again near the Rhine. Mud clung to boots, and rumors of imminent German collapse buzzed through the camp. Patton greeted Bradley with mock grandeur. "General, I've stayed within your borders for 3 weeks. That must be a record." Bradley shook his head with weary amusement. "Congratulations, you're learning geography. Patton pointed toward the eastern horizon. "That's the next line worth crossing." Bradley looked where he pointed, then back at his old partner in both triumph and chaos. "Just try to tell me first," he said quietly. They laughed, short human sound amid devastation. Historians later judged the exchange between the two generals as the quintessential conflict between order and audacity. Bradley represented the system that held a sprawling coalition together. Patton embodied the impulse that knocked holes through enemy lines. The Battle of the Bulge proved both were vital. When asked years later about Patton's defiance, Bradley offered a simple explanation. "Sometimes command means drawing lines. Other times it means erasing them before the enemy does." Patton, had he lived longer, would likely have agreed from the opposite angle. To him, obedience that cost time was worse than rebellion that saved lives. Both views carried truth, and between them, the modern art of coalition command was born. The snow has long melted from the Ardennes, but their echo persists, two towering silhouettes arguing somewhere in that white fog. One voice thunders, "Attack." The other counters, "Coordinate." And together, their paradox carved the road to victory.